Alright, welcome to part 2 of this 3-part series on understanding how diuretics cause hyponatremia. In the first part we discussed very simplistically how salt and water is handled by the kidney, by the nephron, along different points of the nephron. And this part we're going to talk about loop diuretics and how they can cause hyponatremia. So what we'll do is something very similar to the first lesson. We'll label water in blue. We'll label sodium in red. We'll demarcate the cortex and the medulla with a yellow line. So let's make sodium green. And let's show our medullary concentrating gradient, or here in red. And of course the gradient gets steeper and steeper and steeper the farther down you go. And finally, let's follow our urine along the length of the nephron again. Water is freely filtered, and so is sodium. Alright. The proximal convoluted tubule again does most of the reabsorption of sodium and a little bit of water, so we've got a lot of sodium coming out. Back into the bloodstream and a little bit of water. And I say a little bit because there aren't a lot of water channels in the proximal tubule. So at this point right here, X, this is the situation we find ourselves in. We've got a concentration of sodium that's higher in the bloodstream than what we typically see. We typically see a sodium concentration of 135 to 145. But at that point X, we have a concentration that's much greater. And the reason is we've got more sodium reabsorbed than water. Now we get to the thin descending loop of Henle and the loop itself, where there's a lot of solutes in the medulla, and so there is a tremendous osmotic pull of water out of the lumen and back into the body. Alright, so at this point here, which is our second X, we've had a lot of salt removed. Almost 85% of the salt is removed in the proximal tubule. We've had a lot of water removed because of this concentrating gradient that we find ourselves when we're in the medulla. Now we're about to exit the medulla, but before we do exit the medulla, we have an opportunity to reabsorb some salt. And that is through we have an opportunity to reabsorb salt through a particular channel. That's the sodium potassium 2-chloride channel. Now that channel sits in this region here. I'll demarcate that with the orange. Sits in this region here, generally speaking, and that transporter is poisoned because we gave a loop diuretic. So we're not going to reabsorb much sodium here. You're not going to see green arrows. Now we move up to the distal convoluted tubule because nothing is happening here. It's poisoned. So now we're here, and we'll try to reabsorb some of the sodium that we failed to do down here because of our poison. We won't make up the entire difference. The channel that's up here, the transporter that's up here, is not as good as reabsorbing sodium as it is down here. So we're not going to make up the entire difference. Now we're at this point here where we have a little bit less sodium reabsorbed compared to the amount of water we reabsorbed. In other words, we're in a situation right now where we have hyponatremia. We have less salt reabsorbed and more water reabsorbed because we were unable to reabsorb any salt here. Now, here's the trick. Allow this urine to be expelled. And let's do this sequence again. Now let's focus on the medullary concentrating gradient. You notice that this orange box partially overlaps the medullary concentrating portion. In other words, there's some red that's in the orange box. Some of the sodium that's reabsorbed by that transporter, the sodium potassium 2-chloride transporter, allows sodium to come into this medullary area and contribute to this concentration gradient. The remaining sodium gets reabsorbed in this area outside of the medulla, and that goes back into the body, into the plasma. Well, we poisoned this transporter, so we've curtailed or inhibited the kidney's ability to sustain and maintain this medullary concentrating gradient. In other words, what we have the second time around, with the urine now coming after the poison has been applied, is a concentration gradient that's not as strong as it was initially. So I'll draw a little scenario right here. We have, here's your descending loop, and this is in the medulla, coming back up. Your glomerulus is up here. We're approaching the distal convoluted tubule up here, and we have a concentration gradient in the medulla that's not as strong as it once was. This is a much weaker concentrating gradient than we had here because we poisoned that transporter, which is partly required to sustain this medullary concentrating gradient. So what happens? The second time around, when urine is passed, we have water that wants to come out, but not as much is reabsorbed as the first time around, simply because we don't have enough solutes in the medulla. So when you go through this scenario a second time, and a third time, and a fourth time, you will realize that the number of blue arrows here are going to decrease. You're going to reabsorb less and less water because you don't have that gradient. Now, if you reabsorb less and less water, that hyponatremic state that you temporarily were in here the first time around is going to diminish, and you're going to approach eunatremia after each urine passes through the nephron. And that's why we generally say loop diuretics have a difficult ability to cause hyponatremia. It's not that they can't, it's that the ability to cause hyponatremia diminishes as you urinate more and more and more. And that's simply because you've decreased the medullary concentrating gradient, so the number of blue arrows drops. So as urine continues to pass, you're reabsorbing less water each time urine goes through this system, so that ultimately when you get to this point right here, you don't have hyponatremia, you have eunatremia. So I hope you understand why it's hard for a loop diuretic to cause hyponatremia. I hope you can go through this presentation again if you don't understand or you're missing some points. And from here forward, we'll go to the thiazide diuretics.